Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Liebowitz. Several weeks ago, I did an episode about the Austrian economist and classical liberal Friedrich Hayek, but I did it from more of a philosophical, political perspective. So today I have somebody on that's an actual economist that can talk about not only the politics and philosophy of Hayek, but his economics as well. Our guest is a research professor of economics at Duke University. He is also the general editor of the book series, The Collected Works of Friedrich of F.A. Hayek, sorry. He is also the author of Hayek's Challenge, an intellectual biography of F.A. Hayek. Professor Bruce Caldwell, welcome to the program.
Delighted to be here. Delighted to be here.
So, well, I think that Hayek, in broad terms, there could be three aspects to him, and those are the three aspects I want to focus on in our discussion today. There's Hayek, and obviously they're connected, but there's Hayek, the person. He's obviously an individual that had a life outside of academia and polemics. There's Hayek, the economist, and Hayek, the political philosopher. You could probably broaden it and say Hayek, the philosopher, but I don't want to get too much into that because I'm afraid, take us far afield in the discussion. So, who was Friedrich Hayek? I mean, where was he born? Where did he grow up? What was his life like before he became a prominent economist?
Sure. So, luckily, we just finished, we being Hans-Jörg Klausinger and myself, finished the first volume of a two-volume biography of Hayek, where we try to do exactly answer the question that you asked, who was this guy? Because we both had come to him as historians of economic thought, so we emphasized his writings, particularly his economics writings, but also, as you say, he wrote in a number of other fields in addition to political theory, psychology, the sensory order. So he had lots of different contributions. And maybe I should tell the listeners how I got to do the biography.
Sure, that'd be great.
I had written a bit about Hayek's ideas, about his economics, and also about his methodology of economics. And in the course of that, I got invited to do two of the volumes in the collected works. One was on Contra Keynes in Cambridge, the other was on his critique of socialism. And on the basis of that, I got to know the general editor at the time, who was Stephen Kresge, and he was saying he wanted to step down and asked me to become the new general editor, which would actually be the third general editor. The first one was W. Bartley III, Bill Bartley, who was the person who edited The Fatal Conceit, Hayek's final book. So I said, yeah, that sounds great. You know, I'm an historian of economics. I'm interested in Hayek's ideas. This sounds like a great opportunity. And he said, well, what you have to do is you have to meet the family and make sure that they, feel comfortable with you, you feel comfortable with them. And at this point, this is in the early 2000s. So Hayek died in 1992. His family was his son and his daughter, son Larry, daughter Christine. So I was in England. I went down to Devon. I had a meeting with Christine in Larry's kitchen, and then she left, and Larry arrived, and I had dinner with Larry and his wife, and getting to know them. And they're really, really nice people. Really, I felt immediately comfortable with them. But what happened the next day? I spent the night. They had me over as a house guest. And Larry says, look, I want you to come up to my study and I'll show you a bunch of stuff. And there was all sorts of things up there. There were photographs of family trips that Hayek had taken when he was a newlywed. There were maps that I thought were maps because I knew he was he liked climbing. I figured these were mountain climbing maps. These are actually maps that he had used during World War One. Maps of Italy that he had as when he was on this artillery unit on the Italian front during World War One. I didn't know that when I was looking at him, but this is something I thought. I saw that he had a collection of photographs of orchids of various sorts, plants, labeled with their Latin names, dated 1914, 1915, when he's a teenager. And I come to find out that these are things that he went out with his father and he was photography buff at a time when photography was still, it had been around, but not been around forever. It certainly didn't have any smartphones that you just point at it and takes a beautiful picture. So he was taking pictures for his father, who was had his father was a medical doctor, but enjoyed doing plant ecology, basically identifying plants at various regions. So long story short, I realized that by becoming the general editor, I was going to have access to a huge amount of information that nobody else had, that would allow one to tell the story of Hayek in a way that had not been told before. Basically, everything that anyone had about his early life was stuff that he talked about when he gave interviews when he was in his 60s and 70s. And then he would talk about it. And so in a way, it's a way of checking up on somebody's memory when they talk about these things. But that's what we did. So he grew up in Vienna, born in 1899, grew up in Vienna. He was in a family that was very oriented towards intellectual issues. He had two brothers. All three of them went on to become doctors of one sort or another. Both of the others were in natural sciences, and his father was as a physician, but whose passion was the collection of plants. So it was a very kind of intellectual household. He went to war, fought on the Austrian Italian front, came back and attended the University of Vienna. When he was in Vienna, one reason I found Hayek initially attractive, just intellectually, is that he really does manage to be at the right place at the right time, often with ideas that other people don't like. So he's in Vienna in right after World War One, and he meets Ludwig von Mises, who is another famous Austrian economist. He studied under von Wieser, one of the second generation economists. He formed a discussion group along with a guy named Herbert Furt, who included among its members people like Oscar Morgenstern, who, for people who have done social sciences, Oscar Morgenstern with John von Neumann was somebody who developed game theory. So he was somebody who was well connected in Vienna. Went to the United States for 15 months after he got his second degree, and met Wesley Clair Mitchell, who is the father of American institutionalism, one of the movements that, if you've taken the history of economic thought, is really the American kind of approach to economics. It's basically progressivism in economics, essentially. And so he had a class with Mitchell, interacted with him. He comes back to Vienna, gets invited to the London School of Economics to give some lectures. The people liked his lectures. It was in the middle of the Great Depression, and he was talking about monetary theory, so they were certainly of interest to people then. And so he gets invited to become a visiting professor and ultimately to take a position at the London School of Economics. And when he goes there, immediately upon arrival, he gets into this debate with John Maynard Keynes, which has, of course, many of your listeners will know. I mean, they have rap videos about this debate, a couple of them, which are not that bad actually in terms of trying to lay out the ideas. But so Keynes had not yet written the general theory, but he was still a very prominent English economist, and so he's, as soon as he gets to England, he interacts with people that are going to end up being like Keynes. I would say arguably the most famous economist of the 20th century. He also joins a seminar at the London School of Economics with Lionel Robbins. And again, people may not know the history of economics, but the people who attended this seminar, it's like a who's who list of people. And it was during this seminar that basically the graphs that people would encounter in an intermediate microtheory and macrotheory course are all being laid out by people like John Hicks and Caldwell and Abba Lerner and others, GLS Shackle, a whole bunch of them doing really interesting work. And these are all in the seminars that Hayek is running together with Robbins. He goes to Cambridge during World War II because the London School of Economics evacuates up there, And he becomes much closer to Keynes. Keynes he had that early battle, but Keynes actually found him rooms at King's College, his own college at Cambridge. And it's there that Hayek ends up writing The Road to Serfdom. And that becomes a kind of an international bestseller, particularly after it gets condensed in Reader's Digest, which really is what most people at that time actually had read, not the actual book. He After the World War II is over, he in 1947 has a conference that ends up being the founding meeting of the Mont Pelerin Society. And this is a society of classical liberals. These are all people that he had met when he was going around because of the road to serfdom. He got to travel around and meet people. And it was just an absolutely incredible meeting of people who are famous in the liberal tradition in the 20th century. You had the Chicago School of Economics people before it was a Chicago school. So it was Frank Knight, Milton Friedman, George Stigler, Aaron Director, all were invited and attended the meeting. Here was his friends from the London School of Economics, like Lionel Robbins. There were Austrians like von Mises and Fritz Machlup, his friend from actually the Geistkreis days, his discussion group days. There were people from Germany, and one person had been in Germany. Wilhelm Rupke had spent the war in Switzerland, but Walter Eucken had spent it in Freiburg. So they were able to talk about he was able to talk about what it was like to live under Hitler. I mean, it was quite, some of these transcripts from the meetings are quite dramatic. So he's brought together, in other words, basically the liberals from around the world who remained, Western Europe anyway, in the United States, and tries to form them into a discussion group. And that group continues till today. In fact, I did a book for the Hoover Institution based on the Mont Pelerin Society's archives, which are held at the Hoover, which is a transcript of that 1947 meeting. A lot of people who are critics of neoliberalism say, well, this is a secret cabal that they met in 1947, and they're coming up with all these horrible ideas. And I said, look, people say that. Here's what they said at the meeting. Have a look at it, make up your own mind. Yeah. So he helps bring together people in Europe. And then in 1950, he moves to the University of Chicago.
Okay, hold on there, because there's so much you've already said, and I want to cover some of his teaching before then. First of all, you mentioned Ludwig von Mises.
Yep.
Now, I've read that Mises was his teacher. I've read that Hayek was a disciple. I've read that he was just a mentor. I've read that they were collaborators, and Mises's influence over Hayek is exaggerated. My guess is it's somewhere in the mix of that, but I'm not sure. So how much influence did von Mises have on Hayek?
Yeah, great question. So they knew each other in Vienna, but Hayek's major professor at the University of Vienna was von Wieser. And Hayek had sat in on some of Mises's seminars. It's not clear how much he attended them or whether he wrote a paper or anything for them. But their real relationship started after Hayek finished his first degree, and he took a job at an agency, a government agency that had been set up to clear war debts and obligations. You have all these debts that have been undertaken at various points in the past. The world is interrupted by a war. You've got to figure out who owes who what. And so he went to work there, and Mises was his direct supervisor at that. And Mises took him really under his wing. So he really did. So it was much less a student-teacher relationship as it was more of a mentor-mentee relationship during that period when they were working there. So, for example, Mises invited the American economist who came and gave some talks in Vienna, and in the course of that, Hayek had a couple of lunches with the guy, and the guy invites him to come to the United States, which Hayek did, a couple of years later. Von Mises was somebody who had worked on monetary economics. And when Hayek went to the United States, that was the area that he was working on. Von Mises also had written a critique of socialist planning. And when Hayek gets to London, he has his battle with Keynes, but that's over really quickly. And he then turns his attention to letting the English socialists, which was basically everybody at that point, because it was the Great Depression, so everyone thought that the capitalism was over. He said, "Well, look, here's a translation of some articles that were written in German and other languages that will show you that these debates we've already had, and there's some real problems with socialism." So Mises's 1920 paper is one of the articles that is translated in a book called Collectivist Economic Planning that Hayek edited, had a preface to and a conclusion to it, and it was a fundamental piece in the English language socialist calculation debate. So in terms of they had a personal relationship. It was a close one. Whenever Hayek, he went to the University of Chicago, but he'd go back in 1950, but he'd go back to Austria every summer, and he always traveled through New York to see von Mises. So it was a relationship, I mean, to be sure, that they had. They differed, in my mind, they differed a bit on policy issues. Von Mises would be closer to a pure laissez-faire guy, whereas Hayek was more of a competitive order sort of person, but not as far in that direction as, say, Rupke or Lionel Robbins would be. So they do fall on a spectrum in terms of the policy positions that they would take. And in my mind, they also disagree on methodology. And that is a controversial position. People have real strong and varying opinions on that, but in my view, they do differ on that.
I think they do as well. So if you had to sum up, and I know it's a difficult task, a Hayekian economics, like if I was to say, somebody asked me, say, to sum up Milton Friedman's economics, I'd say that Milton Friedman is generally a free market capitalist guy, except for he thinks that the government should control the money supply and allow for basically a constant increase in the money supply. That's how I would sum that up. If you had to give a similar summary of Hayek, what would it be? Of his economics, I mean.
Yeah. So there's three different areas that I think people would identify. The first would be his critique of socialism, and I think that that's fundamental. He treated it scientifically. He was basically saying, look, socialists have these great desires to have a better society, but the means that they articulate is not going to lead to that. It's going to lead to a society that will be, in poverty, and it also sets up the possibility, because it's central planning, it sets up the possibility of bad people getting in control because the government has much more power. So, the idea is that what socialism is defined as, a standard definition of socialism, is public ownership of the means of production. So the state owns the firms. There are no private firms. And von Mises had made the earliest argument, which he said, well, look, if there's no firms, then there's no prices for factors of production. How do firms make decisions about efficient ways to produce goods, lowest cost ways to produce goods in a competitive environment? The ones that make the right decisions end up getting rewarded because they'll have low costs. They'll be able to sell their goods for lower prices, and they'll outcompete their competitors, their rivals. But if you don't have that, you see just what we saw in the Soviet Union. You have massive inefficiencies in production, and very difficult to duplicate the workings of a market system. So that critique was one part of it, that he's working with the Misesian framework to explicate that. But there were socialists also in the 1930s that he was dealing with in England who were saying, well, okay, we can be market socialists. We can duplicate the workings of a market system. We'll just instruct socialist planners to price at marginal cost, to arrange their industries at such that they're producing at the minimum point of the long run average cost curve. So they have all these diagrams and mathematical formalisms that's being developed at the time. They said we can just instruct our socialist managers to do that. And in response to that, Hayek wrote a difficult paper in 1937, and then a wonderful paper in 1945. The 37 one is Economics and Knowledge, where he poses the problem. The 1945 one is called The Use of Knowledge in Society, where he lays out his solution to the problem. But he says basically these models that we're using, and these are the same models that they're using in intermediate price theory today, intermediate micro today. They're all assuming perfect competition. They're assuming that you've got rational agents, and everybody has not only information, but the information is correct. Everybody has access to complete information, and the information is true. And he says, if you look at the real world, it doesn't look anything like that. Yet we still have all this coordination. So the question is, we witnessed, we don't always see coordination, but we see a lot of it. And these models make it easy to get that coordination because you get to equilibrium because everybody knows what they want and they interact and you get to an equilibrium point. He says the real question is, the real world has people who have little bits of knowledge, and some of that knowledge is in fact wrong. It's incorrect. And so how do we get coordination in a world like that? And his answer, not surprisingly, he's a free market economist, is that a well-functioning market system, price system with freely adjusting market prices reflect relative scarcities that people make. They have little bits of information that they have goals. Each person has their own goals, trying to achieve goals either as a producer or as a consumer. And they try to reach these goals, and they use prices to inform, if this is too expensive, I'll buy something cheaper. If I'm using this particular input, maybe I want to use another one. They make these decisions, but all of those individual decisions also feed into the system, which is what creates the prices that everybody is dealing with. So he's really describing there a complex adaptive order in the language that people started to use in the 50s and the 60s that he started to use. It's a complex order, a spontaneous order that is remarkable. If somebody had invented it, he says in the 1945 piece, they would have been considered a genius on the level of Newton, but nobody invented it. It just arises when you have to have a system of property rights that are protected. You can't, if you have everybody just able to knock people on the head, you're not going to get capital formation, all the other things that you have in a market system. But if you've got an institutional setup that allows for people to interact with each other in markets, you'll get that coordination. And it's a powerful insight. It's not a unique insight. Bastiat had it when he said Paris gets fed. That's he's making the same point. Nobody says I'm going to feed Paris. Millions of people, in a sense, cooperate through the process of market competition to accomplish their own goals, but in the process create these things that everybody gains from. So I'd say those are the two really big insights. He also, the notion of the economy as a complex order, I think is a rich idea. And then he has political, he has a vision of what a liberal society should look like that he also did in books like The Constitution of Liberty.
So the critique of socialism, I remember when I read Mises's book, Socialism, written, I think, in 1922, and Hayek wrote an introduction. And Hayek talked about that the thing that seems most difficult for people to understand is the price mechanism and why socialism ruins it. But I was, at the time I read it, and this is going back 2004, I was already familiar with Austrian theory. So it seemed to me obvious, but maybe not to everybody. Maybe I'm wrong, and you can tell me, but that the prices are a reflection of marginal utility and subjective values of market participants. And therefore, they tell entrepreneurs what needs to be produced when prices are rising or falling in various sectors. So it acts as a coordinating mechanism Whereas in socialism, the government owns everything. You don't have that. You don't have money. You don't have prices. So there's no way to know. And I thought that was just when Mises made the point, and Hayek also, it just seems such a powerful critique of socialism, because up to that point, every critique I had read was based on, well, either the morality of it, as in with Ayn Rand's critique, or the idea that it crushes incentives. But Mises and Hayek following said, yes, it crushes incentives, but that's not the main thing. The main thing is it lacks the coordinating mechanism of prices.
Exactly right. You're exactly right.
Okay,
I,
well then,
I would disagree with nothing that you said.
okay, beautiful. Now you mentioned earlier that you edited the book Contra Keynes in Cambridge.
Yes.
Now, in that, there's the debate between Hayek and Keynes, but there's also a debate between Hayek where he's commenting on Messrs. Foster's and Ketchings, I
Yeah,
think
right.
were their names. And that was a prelude to his debate with Keynes. Now, the debate with Keynes was so difficult to follow because
Yep.
each one would keep saying, no, 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 that's not what I meant by that. No, you're saying I meant this. And it went back and forth, and it absolutely drove me batty reading it. And I believe Frank Knight said in response to the debate, I wish somebody could just tell me in a plain grammatical sentence what the hell they're talking about.
Yep.
But there's a claim, and this is what I want to ask you about before we get into the technical aspects of the debate, that at the end of the debate, Keynes said, oh, well, you know what? I've changed my mind on that anyways. So now, I'm going to move on and just, get into other things. Is that true that Keynes basically ceded the point to Hayek in the initial debate before the general theory?
He didn't do that directly to Hayek, but he did write letters to his friends saying, this debate is going nowhere. I'm just going to get down to figuring out exactly what I think. And he, the general theory can be taken, which was published in 1936, Keynes's book that everyone identifies with Keynes. The book that had been under debate was A Treatise on Money, which was published in 1930, and that was what Hayek had reviewed. And the they really did just talk beyond each other, and you should not feel at all bad about not being able to understand that debate. I don't really understand it myself as a Hayek expert. I mean, this will make both of us feel good. So I spent a year at NYU at the time when Ludwig Lockman would spend every spring semester there. And after the first Austrian seminar, he came up to me and said, look, when shall we meet? I said, excuse me, Professor Lockman? He says, yes, Friday, 10 o'clock, my office. So I went to his office on Friday at 10 o'clock, and we had like an hour and a half discussion. And this guy was wonderful because he had a photographic memory. He would just say, okay, you should see this. And he would cite the title and the page and the year of publication of 5 or 6 journal articles. It wasn't a trick. He just knew this stuff. And he asked me to go ahead and read the exchange between Hayek and Keynes, and then Sraffa's critique of Hayek's Prices and Production. So Piero Sraffa, an Italian economist, also wrote a review of Prices and Production that was published around the same time, which was Hayek's rival book to the Keynes's A Treatise on Money. And I struggled with it, and I went in and I said, Professor Lockman, particularly this Sraffa piece, I don't know what's going on. He says, when I came to the London School of Economics in the 1930s and met with Professor Hayek, he gave me this article, and I had the same reaction. So I mean, it's just tough stuff. It is really tough stuff. They both, you can talk about certain ideas that for Keynes, he saw a disjoint between savings and investment, and thought that they can get out of whack with each other, and then savings becomes too great, and this causes a decrease in aggregate demand. That causes firms to pull back, and it causes a recession. For Hayek, he was much more of a believer in markets. He saw the interest rate as equilibrating demand for loanable funds and the supply of savings. But for him, you get, yeah, normally you just say, well, great, yeah, there's a natural rate of interest that equates savings and investment. But unfortunately, changes in the money supply can also affect the market rate of interest. So the market rate of interest is what you see in the world. The natural rate of interest is the one that equates investment demand or demand for loanable funds and the supply of savings. And if you have the money supply doing strange things or the banking system doing strange things, you can get it out of whack. And that's what he's thought was the cause of the downturn. So they had differing theoretical explanations of where the downturn came from. The advantage that Keynes had was that his suggested a policy response. If the problem is inadequate aggregate demand because of over savings, what you need to do is stimulate aggregate demand through tax cuts or increases in government spending. He didn't say all that, but that's what became the kind of the Keynesian message that emerged from the general theory. Whereas for Hayek, he said, well, the real problem is what you did before the downturn. You set things up, and now we got to just kind of get through it. And increasing the money supply is what got us into the problem. And to say that we want to increase it more during a recession is problematical. But a message like that, when people are asking politicians to do something, is not going to go very far. So and you mentioned Milton Friedman before. I mean, all of these ideas are meant to be ideas that can help stabilize the monetary unit so that it can perform its function in the market system. And it's just different ways that people have approached that fundamental problem. I was listening to a podcast this morning as I was taking my walk, where Larry White has a new book talking about Bitcoin, the gold standard, and fiat money, 3 alternative ways of figuring out how you're going to stabilize things. He'd be a great person to have on this program, by the way.
I believe I already sent him a request to come on the show.
Good for you. Good for you.
John Maynard Keynes. So the general theory comes out in 1936, and Keynes does a couple of things. One, he focuses on aggregates, right? It's total demand, total supply, in what became known as macroeconomics. Also, he talks about how aggregate supply and aggregate demand, as you said, can become disjointed, where if people are saving too much, then that money's taken out of the economy and you end up with the downturn. He basically refutes Say's law, or he didn't refute it. He said that it was false, right? So Hayek, in his critique of Keynes, I read it years ago, but it was called the Keynes Centenary in Austrian Critique. And Hayek says that, and I thought it was just a brilliant piece, but he said that when you focus on aggregates the way Keynes does, and by the way, Keynes in his book, it just postulates all types of stuff. Like if it's this amount of money and you increase it by this amount of money, this is going to be the change. I mean, it's just like if one of his assumptions falls apart, then the whole thing falls apart. But Hayek really got into this aggregate stuff. And he said, by focusing on aggregates, you miss what individuals are doing. So you're not going to see the real interactions of the economy. And also in Roger Garrison's, I think it was Roger Garrison's critique, and he probably derived a lot of it from Hayek, was exactly that Keynes didn't understand the coordinating aspect of a natural interest rate, how that is what coordinated present and future actions on whether we want to focus on production for now or focus for the future. Now, of course, if you're injecting money into the economy, or if somebody's manipulating interest rates, that's going to throw the whole thing out of whack. But then the argument from a Hayek would be, don't do that. So I guess my question is, do you think that Hayek's point about focusing on aggregates being a mistake and about the interest rate being a coordinating mechanism, are those sound critiques of Keynesian economics?
Yeah. So let's take the interest rate one first, because I didn't want to do I didn't want to do this because we don't have a blackboard, but I can do it just just
Mises would hate the idea that you were going to use a
yeah,
blackboard.
I'll do a Misesian approach. I'll take the Misesian approach. So we're just imagine society, millions of people, right? And this natural rate of interest is something that finds its level, by the actions of millions of people who are savings. Okay, so they go to their banks, they put in their savings, and then millions of people who are borrowing loanable funds. And we can just imagine, for simplicity, these are firms who are borrowing in order to finance a capital good, some sort of machine that they're going to use. It's going to make their workers more productive and produce more goods. Okay, so how does this interest rate that is formed by the intersection of the demand and supply from these two big groups are very different people. This is one of Keynes's points. The people who are investing are quite different from the people who are saving. He's saying this, it's easy to get out of whack, it's easy to get out of joint. So in a well-functioning monetary system, what that interest rate is, that natural rate of interest that equates demand and supply for loanable funds, that is a price that helps coordinate intertemporal consumption, which is what you just said. And what Roger Garrison was making.
That was this piece. It
Yeah.
just clicked. It was intertemporal coordination in the invisible hand.
Yeah.
That was the name of the piece I read by
Yeah.
Garrison.
Yeah. And here's how it works. So let's say a bunch of us, why do people save? You save because you want something in the future. So if a bunch of people increase the amount that they're savings, right? They're putting more money into the bank. Then the banks want to loan that money out, and that puts downward pressure on that natural rate of interest. So the interest rate falls, and then firms come in and they buy more capital goods because the interest rate is how they finance the capital goods. That's going down. So those on the margin say, okay, I can buy that machine now. It's a little bit more affordable. And they are producing more goods then that are available in the future. Now think what just happened. People want more goods in the future. They save, the natural rate of interest goes down. That signals firms to take actions that will allow more goods to be produced in the future. That's a well-functioning price system. Prices in markets coordinate demand and supply today. The interest rate coordinates intertemporal production and consumption for the future in a well-functioning market system. Now, here's where the problem comes in, because anybody who's had Econ 101 knows that if you increase the money, or Red Friedman, you increase the money supply, that's something else that's going to push down the market rate of interest. Except it's not that people want more stuff in the future. So firms take the same actions, they start producing more stuff, and then they realize they've got all these, they don't have demand for all the goods that they've been producing. And that's what causes the downturn, when they suddenly realize that they're produced too much stuff. When in 2008, when we had the housing crisis and the collapse of the housing market, a bunch of people started calling me, and I'm sure they call everybody even more, saying, tell us about this Austrian business cycle theory, because basically the Austrian cycle theory says, if you keep interest rates too low for too long, you get a bunch of projects started up that can't be finished. And I'm looking at the housing, at the skyline of Las Vegas and Miami, and you've got all these housing starts, high rises that have just stopped. That's the kind of example that really would resonate with the Austrian story about the cycle. Now, having said all that, I'm not a macroeconomist, but I'm enough of an economist to know that every one of these cycles is very interesting in its detail and complexity. So just having one theory typically is not sufficient, but it has legs for describing some aspects of, for example, what went wrong in 2008. The Keynesian theory, it's a convenient theory. It's one that whenever something goes wrong, a politician can say, look, I'm gonna stimulate the economy. Unfortunately, if you really believe the Keynesian theory, you certainly wouldn't be running deficits when you have 3.5% unemployment, or 3.9% now. So it's convenient when you want to throw money at a problem and say, look, I'm doing something, but it's not very convenient when the flip side of it is, well, if you do it at full employment, you're going to cause inflation, which is what happened.
Hayek actually says that Keynes isn't much of an economist at all. He said that he's only really versed in the Marshallian tradition, and that he basically had political viewpoints, and then he developed an economic theory to support those viewpoints, to sort of back them up. But you mentioned that the 2008, in 2008, that drove me crazy because it seemed to me a case study in Austrian business cycle theory.
Yep.
The Austrians actually say that the capital goods sector, the capital markets, is where you're going to see the slump first, and they say that may take place in the housing market. We had a case where interest rates were kept low. You had all these loans made out to people who couldn't afford to make them back. The housing market was boomed, and then it crashed. And all everybody would say was, "Oh, well, hey, this is because of deregulation." I'm just thinking, like, what in God's name are you people talking about? It just seemed like it was convenient for politicians who wanted to increase government power, and that's what they did. They bailed the corporations out, they bailed the banks out, and it just didn't make much sense to me. And subsequently there was some people pushing back on it, but it's still by and large the accepted narrative is that it was deregulation, it was the evil bankers and horrible capitalism that caused that.
Right. So and as I said, it's much more complicated. There were elements of that narrative that I think might be true, but there were so many other things that were going on in terms of not, as you say, not deregulation, but regulations that required banks to make loans.
Sure.
The fact that the people who are the credit agencies, there's only three of them that are looking at the value of these tranches that they were selling and reselling. The whole idea of banks writing a loan and then immediately selling it and not having to keep it on their books is something that didn't used to happen. I mean,
Yeah.
and for people like the guy at BB&T, he came and talked to our students at UNC Greensboro when I was there, and he said, "Look, we keep our stuff on our books, and we don't make loans to people who are not going to be able to pay them back. But if you're not keeping the loans on your books, you'll just write them as fast as you can and get your fee for writing it." So there was all sorts of really perverse incentives that were set up in various ways. And people have that, as you say, that general idea, well, it's just deregulation. It's actually lots of different sorts of regulations that are placed on top of one another that, one of them that was trying to keep firms from making the mistakes from the last crisis was mark-to-market valuations, where you could have firms that were not insolvent, but just for having a liquidity crunch, who ended up having to go out of business because they had to value everything at their market value. And when you have a real rapid downturn, suddenly their books look like they have zero, when they actually have well functioning loans that are out there. It's just that the current value is not high. So there's all sorts of things. There's been some fairly thick pamphlets that were produced at the time. I know Steve Horowitz and Pete Boettke at GMU came out with some that looked at all of the varieties of things that were going on during that downturn. So there are no simple narratives that are convincing to me. I quite agree.
So Hayek,
and by the way, one thing that you did ask, the two parts, Hayek was worried about aggregation. He felt that this was the real action in a market is individuals interacting in markets, and these things that are used in macroeconomics theories, these are all aggregates that they're made up stuff, and you're making policy according to the movement of these aggregates, and it's not. He was very suspicious of that, and he knew that back in the 30s, but it was such a new way of thinking then that he said, "Boy, this is one reason that he said he didn't write a review of the general theory, is that he said, geez, I know it's wrong, but I'm trying to figure out how to say it's wrong." And he certainly, in his Nobel lecture, as well as in some of these retrospective pieces like the one you mentioned, is where he's able to articulate some of those things.
All right, so now we got his economics. We're all experts. Everyone listening now.
Yeah, bunch of little baby Hayekians out there.
His politics. Now, it seems to me that his political theories are like a combination of Edmund Burke, Charles Darwin, where he talks about spontaneous orders, orders that evolve, like language is an example gives that no one just invented language. It came about through, a very long process. And like Edmund Burke, he talked about there's a danger in thinking you're going to meddle with these institutions like the economy, that you can just go in there, the geniuses of society and fix these things. His first, as far as I know, great political work was, like you said, The Road to Serfdom. And this book was just a great critique of totalitarianism. I believe he dedicated it to collectivists of all stripes. What was
Socialists
the
of all parties,
socialists of all parties? Yes, there you go.
indicating that there's a lot of people who call themselves, for example, conservatives or liberals who were in fact
Absolutely,
advocating policies that were
absolutely.
socialist.
Now, one of the critiques of the book that I always thought was silly is that they say, well, look, he's been proven wrong, because he says that once you start going down this road to serfdom, it necessarily turns into a totalitarian state. Now, my whole thing was, why write the book if that's what he thought? His whole point was to curb that from happening. But one, are you familiar with that critique? And
Yes.
do you think it's fair? Because I don't personally.
No, he was writing a warning. He wasn't making a prediction. He doesn't believe in historical predictions. The book was going to be part of a larger 2-volume work in which one of the targets that he criticizes is historicism, which has as the idea that there are laws of history, like the Marxian laws of
Yeah.
motion of the capitalist system. So this is something that he totally thought was bogus. And so he's not saying that. So I agree with you.
So you mentioned the Mount Pelerin Society and the great classical liberal society, and then you were going to get into when he went to the Chicago School. Now, Milton Friedman has said that he finds Hayek's economics unreadable, but he respects him as a political philosopher. While he's at Chicago, he writes the Constitution of Liberty. And you said earlier that he's not quite as laissez-faire as Mises. What were his main political beliefs?
Yeah. So his reason for founding the Mont Pelerin Society was that he wanted to revitalize a liberalism for the 20th century. Liberalism, everybody, aside from the people at Mont Pelerin, thought that liberalism was just in the toilet, basically. And he said, well, how can we justify the ideas that we would identify as liberal ideas? Well, first of all, we got to figure out exactly what they are. And different people in different countries actually have different views on that. So, I mean, the Ordo liberals were much more insistent on having these are the people in Germany, like Röpke and Eucken and their followers, were for a much more active antitrust policy. Aaron Director and Milton Friedman, who at the 1947 meeting actually were closer to that view. By the 1950s, they started to say, well, wait a second. A lot of times antitrust is used by people who are not as successful as the incumbent, and they're just trying to put some shackles on the incumbent in order to be able to enter a market that they can't compete in, or people that have been eliminated from a market because they weren't as good. So there was all different viewpoints on various economic policy issues. And what Hayek wanted to do was to gather together people who would be able to talk to each other, who wouldn't necessarily agree with each other, but his own goal, which is what he accomplished, I think, very profoundly in the Constitution of Liberty, is to articulate the principles under which liberal policies can be justified. And his one of the main ideas coming out of the Constitution of Liberty is the importance of the rule of law. And what he articulates in the Constitution of Liberty is that, well, you've got a set of institutions that will help promote a good society, in his view. These would be a democratic polity in a market system with so you're giving the police power to the state, but then you want to put strong constraints on their ability to use that power. And that's where he invokes the rule of law. The rule of law is something that says it's kind of like a meta principle. It says everybody has to be treated the same when it comes to the law, that nobody's above the law. Laws are made, without any particular aim at helping a particular person or group, but more generally, okay, and they should be made in advance and prospectively, and be something that is generally applied, generally applicable to everyone. And then he talks about various political institutions that are, familiar to Americans, because the American founding was, in his view anyways, very much of a liberal founding, and I think in a number of people's views, where you have a separation of powers, you have that the judiciary, executive, and legislative are all separate. It's even down to the idea of having a bicameral legislature, so you have both representation, but also a smaller. Each state has equal representation through the Senate. Things like the filibuster, other sorts of things that are protecting, that make sure that things that get legislated are deliberated upon, and it's a way of basically making the political system to have kind of competitive forces operating in the political system in the same way that they do in a market system, so that no group or person gets too much power. And I think that, a lot of people complain about markets, saying that they don't think about power. That's not correct. I mean, liberal economists worry about market power, and that's why they endorse competition as a means of social cooperation. And the idea is to have the same sort of thing within your political institutions. Whereas socialism, this is the message of the road to serfdom, concentrates power in a small group of people, and if the wrong people get in there, you've got Stalin and well, lots of examples around the world of what happens in that case. So yeah, that's kind of the political goal that he had in writing the Constitution of Liberty and in informing the Mont Pelerin Society.
So Hayek has a theory of the business cycle. He writes, a lot about that. He engages in debates with John Maynard Keynes, among other people. He writes a lot of political pieces. What is Hayek's lasting impact on both economics and politics?
Yeah. Well, I think his critique of socialism is extremely powerful. And, I think, particularly given today, when it's reported that 40 or 50% of young Americans, when asked, would they prefer socialism or capitalism, say socialism. I mean, it would be good for people to read The Road to Serfdom and then have a discussion about that. First of all, they don't know what socialism is. They're not arguing. If they knew what it was, they wouldn't presumably be arguing for it, but maybe they would. And if so, look at some of the problems that are associated with it. In general, the problems that are, a lot of policy responses to problems that exist in the world end up being things that fix prices. And if you believe his description of a well-functioning market system where prices reveal relative scarcities, where profits help allocate resources towards their highest valued uses, let's put a tax on profits. Let's fix prices in various markets or across the board. All of these are the sorts of, and Trump's going to have 10% tariffs across the board is what he's promising America. Good for us, man. Thanks for taking away a bunch of goods. This is what he's basically doing. Great promises. So these sorts of policy, important policy questions would help by having even a slightly informed reading of Hayek or other economists for that matter. And I think the notion that that the system is a complex system, and that you mess with it you should be cautioned about messing with it. The Burkean idea that you want to take your time when you're making these changes. You can make changes at the margin, but don't go wholesale. I think those are all pretty good lessons. On the other hand, we've got a guy in Argentina who might be going wholesale, and maybe we'll get to see what that kind of. We know what the socialist experiments are like. Not so good, but maybe we'll get a different kind of experiment and see what goes in that direction.
All right. So is there anything that we didn't cover about Hayek that you think we could have covered or should have covered? I mean, obviously we could have covered, but that we should have, that would have been pertinent to the discussion?
Well, I think we've hit all the highlights for sure.
All right.
Yeah, unless there's something that you had in your head, Michael.
No, I was just going to say, no, there's nothing in my head, but I don't know if I want to say that.
Right.
All right. Thank you so much, Professor Caldwell. Is there some place that people can find you?
So I work at Duke University, and yeah, if you Google me, you'll find my email at some point. You'll get to it. And I get a lot of emails, and I try to answer most of them. But if I get to lose my emails because you've got a gazillion listeners, Michael, I might have to delay a while before I answer anything. So
Okay.
yeah,
Well, thanks again for
yeah.
being here. It's been a great discussion.
Thank you very much for having me on.
For now, this is the Rational Egoist signing out. I'm Michael Liebowitz. Till next time.